Operation Barbarossa was the inevitable conclusion of the former partnership between the two dictators. Hitler and Stalin probably both knew that in the end they would have to battle it out. Hitler was faster, but Stalin was far more crafty, and with the help of FDR he would, as we will know, prevail and ensure the certainty of the Cold War. And that is quite a loaded statement after 80 years of a narrative that Hitler's expansionist policies, he simply wanted to conquer more territory for Germany, and jumped the poor unprepared Stalin who hid in his dacha, while his antiquated military was destroyed at will by superior German war machines. And as nobody can claim Hitler innocent of most things during the Second World War, that is a pretty easy sell. But what was Stalin doing, and had been doing, in the previous 20 years? How had he constructed his military, and tested it? He was every bit the dictator that Hitler was, except by the time of 1940 he had killed far more people, both of his own and other countries, than Hitler had, or would. By 1941, Stalin had invaded the same amount of countries that Hitler had. Yet the Western Allies conveniently forgot all about that and sided with Stalin and helped him. Lord knows they helped him with war materials, foods, weapons, money, steel, factories, grain, know-how, to a staggering degree, as I will begin to cover. But why would the Americans especially choose to back a communist dictator, and not the National Socialist one? American banks and industrialists were far more engaged in Germany than in Russia, who had not even honored that country's debt as the communists took over. The relationship between Stalin and FDR, and the infiltration of the FDR government, is a key component of how the war unfolded. The aid was released, and the Cold War resulted from that. Before that, Russia had spent a decade trading with Western nations to cut the technology gap exponentially, which they did, and it was done with blood of millions of Russians, Ukrainians, and many others. And then there was the learning curve for the military. Most people may never have heard about the war against the Japanese army in 𝐾𝐭. It was 1,000 kilometers from the Russian civilization, and it was a crushing victory, but was never really publicized, not even by Stalin. It was a quiet lesson learned by the Russian Army and Air Force, a masterpiece in logistical buildup, staggering camouflage, and a fiercely aggressive combined attack with tanks and ground attack planes, in a deployment which was identical to that in the month before Barbarossa. Many of you may be aware of the book written by Viktor Suvorov, a former KGB officer. Herein he laid out in detail how Stalin was planning an attack on the West, after Germany and the Allies had torn themselves to pieces. In fact, Stalin was in their final stages of readiness, preparing for his attack on Germany to begin in July 6, 1941. The Russian forces were massing for a rapid advance, leaving them exposed to an attack and being surrounded themselves, which is exactly what happened. And looking at the number of forces, from 1939 to 1940, Stalin mobilized his army from 1.8 million men in 1939 to 5 million plus in June 1941, as the Germans had 128 divisions facing Russia, while the Russians had 174 facing west. Germany had 35,928 guns and mortars facing east. The Russians had almost 60,000 facing west. The Germans had 3,700 tanks, many of them Panzer Is and IIs, light or medium tanks. The Russians had 15,687 tanks and 10,743 aircraft against the Germans' 3,425. It makes less sense, since historically speaking, you need a lower number of defenders in order to defend than you do for attack. Suvorov's main argument is that Stalin had planned for an attack, not for defense, and was not positioned well at all for defense, which the events proved correct, given the amount of prisoners taken by the Germans initially. Also, the Stalin line had been stripped of weaponry, mostly, and obviously there were many Western historians who were quick to criticize and dismiss Suvorov's claim, despite his background as an intelligence officer with the KGB, having had access to the documents, none of which Western historians had until decades later. And generally the claim was neglected or downplayed, which is understandable given how many networks and historians have rather left-leaning inclinations. But recently, more and more mainstream historians have begun to come around to the point that it seems more and more likely that Stalin had been planning his Western expansion for many years. After all, one does not just build up a huge military of 5 million active soldiers in a year's time, responding to Hitler's threat after signing a peace treaty with him. It takes a long time to deploy and develop a doctrine, training of the men, trial and error, equipment, machinery, and the Russian military in 1940 was standing on a decade of development, construction, production, and training, but also on the experience of several significant wars they had fought or participated in. And one is little known. The other we know of, the Finnish Winter War, but have we drawn the right conclusions from that? I think it is time we begin to settle this argument, because it makes a difference, especially now where we see the rise of communism and Marxism across the West. These are bad ideas which travel, and we need to understand where they came from and how they travel. Stalin was a communist, a stone-cold killer, and the very foundation for its ideology is for it to spread. As Lenin would say, the goal of the revolution is to spread, namely to spread communism. So a military designed by communists must have a doctrine embedded in it, thus one of aggression and aggressive advance. And that is exactly what Stalin built, a large, fast-moving, aggressive military, certainly not one for defense and passivity. So over the next episodes, I will go over what lessons the Russians had learned from their wars, the politics, and the hardware. What were they actually building? Because depending on your military's doctrine, you construct hardware accordingly. But before we talk politics, they are after all dirtier than sin, let's take a look at the first war in case. 𝐾𝐭. The Battle of 𝐾𝐭 was initially a series of engagements fought from May to September 1939 along the border between Mongolia and Manchukuo. This was Japanese-controlled Manchuria, near the 𝐾𝐭 River, which is 7,000 kilometers from Moscow and 1,000 kilometers from the closest Russian base, and that is significant. What is interesting is that it was the largest tank battle in history at that time. 𝐾𝐭 River marked the contested frontier between Mongolia, a Soviet aligned state, and Manchukuo, a Japanese puppet state, established after Japanese 1931 invasion of Manchuria. The Japanese Kwanton Army operated semi-autonomously, sought to expand Japanese influence into Soviet-controlled territories, eyeing Mongolia and Siberia for resources. The Soviets, wary of Japanese aggression and well aware of developments in Europe to her west, Stalin was determined to defend his Mongolian ally further incursions. The conflict started with minor skirmishes and built up into a major engagement involving over 100,000 troops, hundreds of tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. By August 1939, the Soviet-Mongolian forces under General 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐤, yes, him, numbered approximately 57,000 to 60,000 personnel. This included Soviet troops and Mongolian units, primarily from the 1st Soviet-Mongolian Army Group. General 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐤, then he was a 42-year-old Corps commander with Russian Civil War experience. He led the Soviet forces. His chief of staff, 𝐦𝐨𝐫𝐞, and other officers later became key figures in World War II. General 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐤, commander of the Trans-Baikal Military District, oversaw logistics. The Soviets deployed 844 tanks and armored vehicles, including BT-7s, fast light armored tanks with a 45mm gun, effective in open terrain. Then T-26 light tanks with similar armament, used for infantry support. Also a bunch of armored cars, BA-10, BA-20 models, for reconnaissance and rapid strikes. They had over 500 artillery pieces, including 76mm field guns and 122mm howitzers, providing overwhelming firepower. The Soviets transported 18,000 tons of artillery shells, with 3,800 trucks and 1,375 fuel tankers over 868 miles through desert routes, and that is significant. The Soviet Air Force conducted 2,015 bomber sorties and 18,509 fighter sorties, expending over 1 million 7.62mm rounds and over 68,000 20mm cannon rounds and 1,200 tons of bombs. The aircraft used were the I-15, I-16, and some older 153s. Many pilots were veterans from the Spanish Civil War, having given them combat experience and an edge. That was another war Stalin got involved in and came out of with the entire gold supply of Spain in return for relatively little. Now, the real story here is that the Soviets overcame a 434-mile distance, about 1,000 kilometers from their nearest railhead in Bortussia, employing a massive logistical effort to sustain through some of the worst and most inhospitable terrain and desert ever. The operations in the desert. Now imagine what it takes to transport by truck that much material and people that far. Not only did they have to move all the material, but they also the fuel for themselves and spare parts for their journey. And the buildup was done in secrecy. The Japanese had no idea. Russian officers all took off their insignia, traveled as workers or private soldiers. Units were disguised and boarded privately or in the field. And everybody had to be fed as well. And also the positions had to be constructed and camouflaged. The Japanese 6th Army, primarily the 23rd Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Mitsutara Kumbasu, fielded approximately 40,000 troops with an estimate of up to 75 to 80,000 at its peak. Manchukuo's cavalry and infantry supplemented these forces, and Japanese forces were well trained and combat experienced in the area as well. The Japanese deployed around 180 tanks, significantly fewer than the Soviets, including the Type 95 light tanks with 37mm guns, underpowered against Soviet armor, the Type 89 medium tanks, slow and outdated. The Japanese used tanks in small, piecemeal formations as infantry support, per their doctrine. And this is at a time where we need to understand that tank doctrine was still something most armies around the world were still very conflicted on. But the French doctrine, for instance, was similar to this. They fielded about 130 artillery pieces, including 75mm field guns and mortars, but lacking the volume and range of Soviet artillery. The Japanese Army Air Force flew an estimated 10,000 fighter and bomber sorties, firing 1.6mm 7.7mm rounds and dropping 970 tons of bombs. They flew the Nakajima Ki-27, a modern monoplane fighter, competitive but outnumbered, and the Kawasaki Ki-10, an older biplane fighter, outclassed by the Soviet I-16s. At the end of the battle, they lost 162 aircraft and 152 dead and 66 severely wounded aircrew. The Japanese, however, had a logistical advantage, with railheads only 100 miles from Nohaman and 2 dirt roads to the front, compared to the Soviets, about 1,000-kilometer supply line. However, their intelligence failed to anticipate the Soviet buildup, which is noteworthy. The Russians moved a huge force in secrecy, doubling the Japanese. Soviet tanks, particularly the BT-7, was faster. It was better armed than the Japanese light tanks. Soviet aircrafts, bolstered by Spanish Civil War experience, outperformed the Japanese air forces in coordination and numbers. Now, the doctrine emphasized infantry-centric tactics, night attacks and Bushido-inspired aggression, with tanks used sparingly as support. Soviet doctrine under Zhukov prioritized combined arms, integrating tanks, artillery, air support for decisive maneuvers. Now, this was, true, not a million-man large-scale battle. It was, however, a multifaceted battle, almost a large-scale sand table exercise where he could truly test the Soviet doctrine and polish the rough edges. The war began on May 8, 1939, with initial skirmishes between the Mongolians and Japanese drawing in Russian troops to support the Mongolians, inflicting 63% casualties on the Japanese. They were commanded by Colonel Yasutaka Atsuma when initially surrounding the Japanese, who then returned with a 2nd Air Brigade and attacked the Soviet airfields there on June 27th. However, Tokyo had not approved this and banned more air attacks. Zhukov had arrived on June 5th and had begun bringing armored cars, light tanks, and aircraft to bolster the defenses. While building his forces, the Japanese attacked in July. The Japanese Northern Prong attacked the 3 regiments, 71st, 72nd, and parts of the 64th Infantry, plus 26th Infantry. They crossed the 𝐾𝐭 River, aiming for Bachikagan Rill and Kawataga Bridge. The Japanese Southern Prong and the 1st Tank Corps, the 3rd, 4th Tank Regiment Infantry and Artillery attacked Soviet positions east of the river. Zhukov, however, had expected this and had planned accordingly. He countered with 450 tanks and armored cars, repulsing the Northern Prong by July 5th, defeating the Southern Prong by July 9th. Japanese anti-tank guns and Molotov cocktails proved ineffective against Soviet armor. August 3 to 8th, Zhukov launched 3 small-scale attacks to probe the Japanese positions. Aggressively, he lost 1,000 men versus only 85 Japanese killed. But this is Russia, and casualties does not matter, only results, something which has never changed. So by August 20th, Zhukov was in position and ready. He launched his decisive offensive. He launched a classic double envelopment on August 20th, first using heavy artillery and infantry to pin the Japanese center, while tanks encircled both flanks. By August 30, the Japanese 23rd Division was surrounded. Artillery and airstrikes decimated the encircled forces, with most Japanese refusing to surrender per the Bushido doctrine. By August 31st, Japanese forces on the Mongolian side was destroyed. It was a decisive victory, and very soon after, on September 15th, remember that date, a ceasefire was agreed upon. To the Japanese, who had alliances with Germany, it was now clear that they stood alone, driven by the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact signed on August 23rd. The Japanese, surprised by Germany's pact with the Soviets, sought to de-escalate, and this war ended efficiently and effectively until the Russians attacked them in 1945, after the war in Europe had ended, again showing Stalin's way of diplomacy. The Battle of 𝐾𝐭 was a proving ground for Soviet military doctrine and leadership, offering critical insight into warfare and the perils of aggressive war. The lesson learned shaped Soviet tactics and strategy in World War II, particularly under Zhukov's command in Moscow in 1941 and Stalingrad in 42-43. The key lessons included: the battle validated the Soviet doctrine of integrated infantry, tanks, and artillery and air support into a cohesive force. Zhukov's double envelopment relied on artillery barrages to fix the enemy, tank pincers to encircle, airstrikes to destroy pockets of resistance. This contrasted sharply with Japanese infantry-centric tactics. The success of combined arms at 𝐾𝐭 became a blueprint for Soviet operations in World War II. Zhukov employed similar tactics at Stalingrad, using pincer movements to trap the German Sixth Army. The battle also heightened the need for better coordination. And early Soviet tank attacks, for instance, July 1939, failed due to poor infantry support. The Soviet numerical and qualitatively advantage in tanks exposed the vulnerability to infantry-heavy armies against mechanized forces in open terrain. The Japanese anti-tank measures and Molotov cocktails, 37mm guns were inadequate, underscoring the obsolescence of infantry-centric doctrine. The battle prompted the Soviets to refine tank designs, installing larger cannons and lockable hatches, which was tested at 𝐾𝐭. That influenced the design of the T-34, a mainstay of World War II. The experience of facing Japanese suicide attacks also informed Soviet anti-infantry tactics for armored units. The Soviets' ability to sustain 57,000 troops and 484 vehicles and thousands of air sorties over 434 miles of supply line demonstrated the importance of robust logistics. And quite frankly, to use 3,800 trucks and 1,375 fuel tankers to deliver all these thousands of shells, tons of fuel, was a logistical triumph. This experience taught the Soviets logistics during World War II, enabling rapid transfer of 18 divisions, 1,700 tanks, 1,500 aircraft from the Far East to the Western Front in 1941, critical to halting the German advance in front of Moscow. Zhukhov's aggressive command style, honed in the Russian Civil War and the combat experience from the Spanish Civil War as well. It is often mentioned that Stalin's purges had weakened the officer corps, but at 𝐾𝐭, that was a showcase of the resilience of the surviving commanders. Suvorov makes a note that the commanders purged were mostly those who were focused on defensive strategy, not those with a highly offensive spirit, and thus the purges did not have as much meaning as Western historians have previously thought. We will get back to that matter later. The battle, however, emphasized the need for a layered, flexible defense to absorb enemy assaults before counterattacking. The battle reinforced the Communist Party's role in the military mobilization, as well as its industrial policies enabled the production of tanks and supplies critical to victory. This political-military synergy became the cornerstone of Soviet World War II strategy and the cause for starvation for many of its people. However, the casualty figures here is hard to gauge. Official Soviet figures report about 10,000 casualties, with 8,000 killed or missing and 15,000 wounded. Some sources estimate up to 17,000 total. The Japanese records report 20,000 battle and non-battle casualties, with estimates ranging from 17,000 to 45,000. Some Soviet claims inflate this to 61,000. Up to 30% of the casualties were, however, due to dysentery, possibly for contaminated water, or even Soviet biological warfare. Now, this is not confirmed, but keep in mind that German scientists had previously been invited to Russia to work on their combat gases and chemical weapons with the Russians, so it's not impossible that the Russians would have used this on this remote location to test theirs. The dates, however, are interesting. On August 20th, 1939, upon signing the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, the next day Zhukov began his attack, completely crushing the Japanese army. The fighting ended on September 16th. The very next day, Soviet troops invaded Poland. The Soviet military and diplomatic offensive stunned Japan. The non-aggressive pact left Japan diplomatically isolated from its German ally. Faced with the prospect of dealing with the Soviet Union on its own, Japan moved quickly to de-escalate the conflict, and eventually signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. In April 1941, once again clearing Stalin's back before beginning a battle with his opposing front. Stalin was a very smart man. He knew all too well that he did not want a war on multiple fronts, so before starting one military action in one direction, he would sign a treaty with a possible opponent on the other. A month before mounting largest tank battle in the world had ever seen at that point in 𝐾𝐭, a well-planned, determined attack on a determined enemy, he would sign a peace treaty with Germany, and after ensuring a peace, at least for a while, with Hitler, he eradicated the threat from Japan, and taking his half of Poland, which was the deal he had made and signed with Ribbentrop. It was not just a non-aggression pact, but also a deal where between the two powers divided Poland. Stalin did not move into Poland to save them from the Germans. They planned an invasion together. and after the Battle of Poland, the two powers held a military parade together in the city of Brest to celebrate the outcome. Here are Russian and German officers, soldiers, generals, celebrating together. I wonder why this footage did not find its way to the Nuremberg trials. But Stalin did not stop there. In the following year, he would also invade Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Bukovina, Bessarabia, and since he had a peace treaty with Germany, the only possible threat west, he now demanded territory from Finland, who of course refused, so Stalin launched a war on them. The Germans friendly with Finland did not aid the Finns initially due to the pact with Stalin. Their relationship did not break down until Russia began demanding control of parts of Romania and other parts of Eastern Europe. Sensing he had probably gotten as much as he could get, basically for free, Stalin knew it was soon time for military action against Germany and the West. So he signed a non-aggression pact with Japan in April 1941, just like he did before, keeping his back clear. He began his military buildup in the West, and Stalin had been extremely clever to not go into Poland until after Hitler had, and after the French and Brits had declared war on Germany. Yet all of these allies did not declare war on Russia, no matter how many countries Stalin invaded. And that does beg the question as to why. The British and French declared war to protect Poland, a country they would eventually completely abandon to Stalin. Just like all the other countries Stalin had invaded, there was initially a growing sense of antipathy against the Russian aggression in America and Britain, with more and more calls to help the Finns and even send troops to fight the Russians. So strange dilemma, since the Germans did send some weapons, as did the British and Americans, finding themselves, oddly enough, on the same side for a moment. This was particularly what Stalin did not want, and having to take charge of the battlefield in Finland, settling a peace with the Finns before the West had a chance to solidly side against him. Stalin's diplomacy and infiltration into the FDR administration should not be underestimated, and it will soon becoming clear that FDR and many in his administration held deep sympathies for the communist Russians and Stalin himself, something which would play a significant part in the Second World War, much to the detriment of the rest of the world. Stalin's plans for taking over the West is documented by statements made to this effect years before even Hitler came to power in Germany. And Stalin's diplomatic initiatives bears out a clear path, clearly defined by his wish for conquest, and anchors his military actions. But also his military developments and production clears out the path towards an aggressive war, not a plan for one based on defense. Now, I wanted to focus on the Russian side of the war, but the logic of a planned Stalin's first strike becomes more and more evident, because despite the Russians' forces composition, they were still better prepared for a fight than the Germans, as were their logistics. Operation Barbarossa was a logistical feat, certainly, but it had vast holes in the long-term planning, and no provisions for winter was prepared. And German planners were not unaware of their own shortcomings, but they were forced to jump off in June, forced by Stalin's buildup. More on that in 1939, when the Russians and Germans were high on rhetoric against each other. Germany was seen in Russia as the enemy, and vice versa. But in September, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had been signed, seemingly laying ground for peace and partnership, Stalin conscripted 5 million more soldiers for a 2-year period, a period which will thus be up in September 1941. So he had to strike before having to let all his soldiers go. But what did the Russian military actually have? And what had they been working on? We've all been told that the Russian Air Force was outdated, not nearly as good as the German, and their tanks were flimsy and under-armored in 1941. That is why it was so easy for the Germans to simply destroy so much Russian hardware in a few weeks. We all know the numbers the Russians had. And quoting Napoleon, quantity have a quality of its own, certainly. And certainly the Russian equipment was crude, with rough edges. The planes were not as fast or as well armed initially as the Germans, and the tanks were not as user-friendly and perhaps as precise as the Germans. But some of them were, and some of them were far better armed than almost anything the Germans had at the time, and certainly many of them were faster. Some could swim, some could be air-delivered, something no other army at the time could boast of. The Red Army had 3,500 of the T-Series amphibious scout tanks. Latest modern T-40, fast, acceptably armed, could be dropped from a plane. At 5 tons weight, it was armed initially with a 12-7 heavy machine gun, later with a 20mm cannon and a machine gun. Why would you need such a vehicle in a defensive war? A fast scout car which could swim and even be dropped in a lake. Actually, the kind of thing goes really well with the million paratroopers they also had, and these were captured, were used by the Germans readily and labeled as the Panzerkampfwagen T-60. So all bad they couldn't have been. Then there was 11,000 T-26 light tanks, developed initially from the British 1929 Vickers design. It was armed with an excellent 45mm cannon, when comparable to German light tanks only were armed with a 37. It has served well in Spain and against the Japanese certainly, but in 1941 it was being replaced with newer and heavier Russian tanks, but it was still the most represented Russian tank deployed. They were still superior to the German light tanks, but were showing their age by 1941. Despite being replaced, some saw service until 1944, and many of their losses were from German aircraft in the opening month of the war. Then there was 8,000 of the BT series of tanks. They were extremely fast and better armored, and per evolution they went from the 37 to the 45 to the 76mm guns, and were also up-armored as well. It was seen as a medium cavalry tank, but it was fast, 72 kilometers an hour on the road, which is damn good. So the two largest contingents of Russian tanks represented were well armed with things that could destroy German tanks, the 45, but they both had relatively weak armor. Even that was upgraded, and having riveted armor did not help when impacted by most things hurling around a modern battlefield. However, why would the Russian army need a tank which could speed at 72 kilometers an hour on roads when the Russians didn't have any such paved roads? All of those were in the West. And then, of course, there was Stalin's three-headed monster, and I do personally love the T-28. A little more than 500 of them were made. It was considered a medium tank at 28 tons with 3 turrets, an excellent 76mm cannon, and early models with the 45, and then 3 and 4 machine guns. It had a crew of 6. Several hundreds of them had been destroyed in the Winter War with Finland, and repaired, and back in action, and so forth. Some had been destroyed over 5 times, and went back to action. The Finns captured several of them that were still used by the end of the war by the Finns. By the time of Barbarossa, there was 411 of them available, but many of these were abandoned by their crews with mechanical problems. They were, after all, aging. Still, some fought on in the Battle of Leningrad. It would move at a fair clip of 43 kilometers an hour, certainly fair by 1940 standard, and of that weight with 3 turrets. But then again, showing its age, and it was being phased out as well. But I'm not done with the T-28. The production of this started in 1932, at a point where nobody in the world had anything like this. Let's fast forward to, shall we say, 1939. The best tank the Germans had at that time was the Panzer IV, with 15 to sometimes 30mm of armor. The T-28 had 30mm. The Panzer IV had a 250 horsepower engine. The T-28 had a 500 horsepower engine and 4 to 5 machine guns, as opposing to the Germans' 2. Germans had a gun of a 76. roughly comparable to the Russians' T-28's 75mm gun. But in 1937, that was upgraded to an L-10 26 caliber as opposed to the German 16.5 caliber, with shell velocity of 385 meters a second versus the Russian L-10 of 555 meters a second. The Germans then installed a 300 horsepower engine in later models and upgraded the armor to 30 millimeters. But by then, the T-28 had been upgraded to 80 millimeters and were planning to install an 85 millimeter gun. And I'm not knocking the Panzer IV. It became arguably one of the best tanks of the Second World War and had plenty of rooms for upgrades. But this is 1939, 1940, 1941. What tank in the world then had an engine with the horsepowers of over 500? Britain had any? No. The US? Oh, good Lord, no. France maybe came close with the 307 horsepower on the Charby, but in fact, the only tanks with an engine with 500 horsepowers was the T-28, the T-34, and the KV-1. And seriously, damn, the tiny BT-7. Seriously. And similar to the T-35, which was also a multi-turreted tank, heavy by 45 tons, with a 30 kilometers road speed, and a crew of 10 people. And you all made fun of the mouse. It had a 76mm gun and two secondary 45mm guns. You have to love this thing. But there was only 60 of these made. But I wanted to mention it because it shows that the Soviets were capable of thinking big and building big at the time. But for real innovation, we have to go to the KV-1s and 2s and the T-34, of course. The Russians had learned from their previous years of war, Spain, China, Finland, and watched the German blitzkrieg. They had put into production something that was producible and arguably almost better than anything they'd seen. The KV-1 and the super heavy KV-2 and the medium T-34. In June 1941, there was about 1,000 T-34s, about 1,000 KV-1s and 2s. The KV-1 had a 76mm gun, and the KV-2 had a huge 152mm gun, firing a 48-kilogram shell. Nobody had anything remotely like that. In fact, even today, no tank has a gun with that size. These heavy tanks were especially good at rolling up to enemy bunkers and lobbing heavy shells at them. You definitely do not need something like that for a war defense. And they were now beginning to roll off the production lines in Russia, along with the T-34s that we all know. It was not the first tank with sloping armor. It was not particularly advanced. The crew may have been a bit overworked, and not enough of them had radios. But it was one of the best medium tanks of the war, and it was producible. The Russians managed to make over 40,000 of them in 5 years. It was crudely made, rough in the welds, constructed well where it needed to be, and less so where it wasn't. There was only about 1,000 of them in 1941, and most of them were not in position. Many of them still sitting on their trains, many of these not calibrated yet. Their crews had not yet been trained, and it was not the best evolution of the T-34 either. But by July, 1,000 T-34s and 1,000 heavy tanks rolling against Germany's 3,500 tanks, and most lighter tanks like the T-38s with the short barrels would have wrought havoc on German assembly lines had the Russians jumped off first. There were cases where the KVs would roll deep behind German lines, shoot up convoys and trucks, and being engaged by multiple AT guns, both 37s and 50s. Nothing could penetrate. Even the 88 had problems with the KVs. So it wasn't until the Germans figured out how to deal with them and brought a lot of tungsten core munition that the danger was really solved. For all KVs and all T-34s destroyed in 1941, the Germans fired 300,000 tungsten rounds. But the T-34s were in operation on the first day. The German 7th Panzer Division, mostly of Czech T-38s with 37mm guns, encountered 44 of them and still managed to knock out 27 of them. So they were active and they were being dealt with. So, to some degree, the fight on the ground was more fair. But the keys to the German success was certainly better training and the surprise first attack. But not because the Russian enemy was inferior in equipment, especially not when one takes into consideration the amount the Russians had managed to build. But this was a war which was won in factory halls in America and Russia. Even in the month after Barbarossa, almost 500 more T-34s was delivered as replacements for those destroyed. So the production lines were rolling by then. By September 1942, an assessment was that the T-34s had been knocked out 20% by 5-centimeter short guns and 50% by 5-centimeter long guns. And then, of course, there's the famous 203mm self-propelled howitzer. You definitely do not need that for defensive war. And that one rolled all the way to Berlin when the Russians reversed the war. Oh yes, by the way, the Russians also had a top-secret ramjet program in the 1930s, so they may have had a problem shooting their designers and engineers, causing production delays, but they certainly had good ideas which were not obsolete. And yes, they did have production problems and bottlenecks. But when FDR began to send them everything and anything they wanted and needed, that solved the problem, and it helped retrieve those designers that was still alive from the gulags, which fortunately had not been shot, putting them back to work again. But wait, there's more. So much more. There's the strange case of the Soviet heavy bomber, the one which really wasn't, but it was. In 1930, the TB-3 flew for the first time, and it was the world's first cantilever wing, 4-engine heavy bomber in all metal. It could carry a heavier bomb load than anything at the time, including dropping paratroopers. It could deliver tanks. It was also well armed. It could even host 2 parasite fighters, which could be delivered and retrieved in flight. It was far ahead of its time, but given the developments in the 1930s, it was soon obsolete, given that it was slow compared to fighters of that day. 819, however, was constructed, with over 500 in service by 1941. It was groundbreaking for its time, no doubt, but it spurred on the next generation of heavy bomber, the TB-7, which flew for the first time in 1936. A very well-built advanced heavy bomber for its day, with 5 engines, one in the fuselage driving a supercharger. This would eventually go away and not needed, however. It was initially heavily armed with machine guns and cannon, and could lift a 5-ton bomb load. It had an extremely long range. It flew Molotov to the U.S. at one point, at a ceiling of 30,000 feet. Again, something few planes could brag of in 1936, if indeed any. So the Soviets had the technology to create amazing record-breaking planes. But the TB-7 only produced some under 100 in number for reasons. Strange reasons, honestly. It actually makes no sense to develop an amazing, super heavy, long-range bomber with the latest technology and then not really build any of them. Now, there are a few reasons for that. Rather a problematic-laden development process, namely that Stalin kept having the designers sent to Siberia vacation places. Then the builders, or the engineers, were arrested, and the engines were hard enough to source as it was without having to arrest all the people who built them. It was also, therefore, flown with several different engine types, including diesel. Without going into details on that, you can go to Rex Hangar. He did a great video on this plane. You check that out. Eventually, an amazing plane was finished and ready to go. And as we know, Russia is the home of the heavy bomber, and the build it or I'll have you all shot policy. So if Comrade Stalin wanted it built, it could have been, at a time where Hitler had no strategic planes because he was focusing on tactical aviation for his blitzkrieg. So if Stalin wanted to deter attack from anybody, He could have built a lot of these high-flying, heavy bomb-laden planes which could reach out and touch any capital of any country who dared attack. During the war, several TB-7s flew over Germany at such an altitude they were never fired upon or even attempted intercepted. And it still flew a decade after the war. It was exceptional for its day. But Stalin chose to not mass-produce it. Why? For the same reason, perhaps Hitler did not pursue strategic aviation. Well, many of the members of the Soviet General Staff formed in 1935 was opposed to it, and the leading aviation theorist Commander 𝐸𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞𝐿 wrote to Stalin that bombing an enemy's production centers, bridges, and roads may be fine, but if one wanted to invade a country, it would be far better to destroy his army in the field, leave the bridges as they would be needed in an invasion, and then take the production intact and repatriate it to Mother Russia, which is exactly what Stalin did in every country he invaded and kept. Thus, the key focus was to produce as much tactical air as possible, ground attack planes which could support soldiers and tanks. And I don't have to tell you about the absolute master of that, the 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞. Stalin got his fast-paced invasion. He just got it a few years after he had planned to. And what did the Germans find when they crossed the frontier? They found 25,000 rail wagons full of munitions and fuel near the border, right near the border. But the Red Army knew about defense in depth. But they were deployed exactly like the Germans were deployed. Nobody would position themselves in a vulnerable way, as one does when preparing for an attack, if preparing for defense. And that's the problem. So if you pack all your gear, planes, tanks, into pre-attack assembly areas, they are extremely vulnerable to attack. Just like the Germans would have been had the Russians attacked first and struck them in their assembly areas. And certainly the Germans' training and doctrine initially was far better than the Russians, and of course the problem with the communist dictatorship is that with commissars embedded with the soldiers, nobody is willing to take initiative. Everybody is afraid to act without orders in hand, physically holding the paper. There is a saying in Russia, the more paper you have, the cleaner is your ass. And it does translate. 𝐤𝐿𝐵 had the plan to attack Germany written up and presented to Stalin. The 𝐤𝐿𝐵 document, which was discovered in the archives of the President of the Russian Federation some years ago, for ultimate security, it had been handwritten by later Marshal A.M. Vasilevsky and addressed to the chairman of the USSR Council of the People's Commissars, Joseph Stalin. The document marked top secret of great importance, Stalin's eyes only, one copy only. It was authorized and approved by the People's Defense Minister S.K. Timoshenko and 𝐤𝐿𝐵, then Chief of the Red Army General Staff. In order to prevent a surprise German attack and to destroy the German army, I consider it essential that under no circumstances should the initiative of freedom of action be given to the German High Command. I consider it essential to preempt enemy deployment to attack the German army when it is still in the stages of deployment and has yet not had the time to organize his front and the interaction between his serviced arms. The word preempt was underlined twice in the original document. Thus did 𝐤𝐿𝐵 propose to Stalin precisely what the German army would do to his forces a month later. And there's more. A large part of the industrial production, mining, gold mining, was done by political prisoners. The Soviet Gulag system is notorious and well lamented. Decades before Hitler and decades after, the Soviet penal camps held millions of slave laborers who were worked to death. And many top Russian airplane designers, rocket engineers, scientists had visited the camps for a while. Some special camps were even designed, where they were still designing and construction technology of war for Stalin, because why would he have to pay them if you can just keep a gun to their head? Also, many of the purged in the Great Purges went to the gulags from where they were later returned to military service. But before Barbarossa, Stalin began to retrieve prisoners from the camps. 1 million of them were recruited, came straight from the camps, and were armed and sent to the western border. They were expendable, but brutal, given where they had just come from. This was a brilliant way to tie down the enemy while not losing good soldiers who were sitting ready in the second echelon. Now remember, this was done before the war, unlike today, where Putin did it after a year of heavy losses in Ukraine. Some things never change in Russia. Upon his return from the successful Blitzkrieg operation, he had orchestrated in the Battle of 𝐾𝐭 in Mongolia, August 39, Marshal Zhukov was put in charge of the Kiev Special Military District, where he commanded the Soviet southwestern and western fronts. His plan of May 15, 1941, was assigned to these fronts the task of destroying the Wehrmacht units before them, then advancing southwest across Poland to the German border. This operation was intended to cut German forces off from the Balkan theater and operations and from their Romanian and Hungarian allies, including the vital oil fields. And of course, Stalin was going to invade Romania for its oil. That made it easy for the Germans to get them involved in the invasion the other way. This was one of the points of contention which finally began to break the back of the collaboration between Hitler and Stalin in the first place. These were negotiations almost up until the eve of Barbarossa. Molotov, with his direct demand and tone, having seriously angered Hitler at their first meeting, the cracks were showing. Take away propaganda rhetoric and election speeches, it is not entirely clear how far east Hitler's intention was to attack, or when. Clearly his rhetoric was always in that direction, as both countries' propaganda was aimed at each other. But as British diplomacy was not doing it for Stalin, he chose to embrace Hitler. And as Molotov's train had rolled into Moscow in 1939, Soviet and swastika flags had lined the route, and both countries had silenced their respective propaganda for a while. But it was quietly quite clear to all that a war between the two dictators was going to happen one way or another. Hitler knew, and Stalin knew. But it seems both were initially hoping it would not kick off until later. But by summer 1941, the cards were stacked and time was running out. So the race was now on about who would jump off first. Zhukov was unaware that the main deployment of German forces was not on the Soviet left flank, but in Army Group Center, further to the north. Thus, had Soviet forces attacked towards the Krakow-Lublin, as Zhukov's plan called for, Army Group Center could easily have cut through and exposed the right, northern flank of the Soviet thrust, upset the Soviet offensive, and then advance along this Minsk-Smolensk line towards Moscow. In that event, the Red Army would have found itself in an even worse situation than after the outbreak of the actual German offensive in June 22nd. Zhukov admitted as much later to a military historian, V.A. Anfilov. In retrospect, it is good that he did not agree with us. Otherwise, our forces may have suffered a catastrophe. Stalin have demanded a repositioning of the forces, and another hint the Russians were about to move forward was the abandonment of the Stalin line outside Kiev. Equipment was moved forward, and work on the Molotov line running through the newly acquired territory taken in 1939 was slowing down. Troops were in place, now clearing paths through their own minefields. Field hospital units were moved right up to the demarcation line. That is not something you do when fearing an attack. But the Russian attack was to begin in typical Blitzkrieg fashion, without warning, with air raids on enemy airfields, with heavy artillery bombardment of frontline enemy forces. The Soviets would thus have had a clear advantage of superior forces and the benefit of a first strike, and in most places of the front, the Red Army held at minimum a 2-to-1 advantage over German forces. In a more detailed study of May 15th document, L.A. Brzezinski notes that the plan had even more ambitious goals. After the completion of the Soviet First Strike First Stage, the Soviet forces would then turn north and northwest to destroy the northern wing of the German front, thereby occupying East Prussia and all of Poland. Meanwhile, to the north, the Red Army would once again invade Finland. According to Brzezinski, Zhukov's bold offensive plan had very probably been influenced by Stalin's speech of May 5th to Soviet military academy graduates, in which the Soviet leader emphasized the superiority of offensive over defensive military planning. The Soviet mobilization and deployment in the period of January to June 1941 took place in 3 stages. First stage, January to March, the call-up of about 1 million more reservists. Industry ordered to step up production of T-34 and KV tanks. First echelon troops brought up to strength. Second stage, April to June, second echelon forces moved to the western border. Far eastern troops moved west. Third stage, June 1 to June 22nd, Stalin agrees to open mobilization and to advancing second echelon armies to the front. All these operations were to be carried out in secrecy, without the enemy taking note. Once mobilized and in position, the Soviet forces were to launch a sudden, decisive offensive against Germany and her allies. And one more piece of physical proof of this time is the Stalin Metro. Given the huge numbers of troops and materials which would have had to be moved through choke points like Kiev in order to supply troops and material to the vast military campaign into Germany, these choke points would have to be streamlined. And here in Kiev, we see still today the remains of those transport hubs in construction. Stalin and Zhukov had begun to build a huge underground rail system under the rivers in the city, supported by above-ground bases. These were not completed by the time the Germans got there, but here are still the parts of them. The concept was to sink down these caissons under the rivers and into the soil, supply air from above, as well as access, and when complete, supply trains could simply run under the city straight to the front.
Вся эта конструкция опускалась под землю
This whole construction went down
на глубину 47 метров.
47 meters below.
Так, перед рабочими сделалась кирпичная стена.
There was a concrete wall in front of the workers.
Когда опускалась под землю,
When it went down,
создавалось большое давление воздуха.
there was high air pressure.
Вот. Разламывалась стена.
The wall broke.
Острые ножи подавались с помощью больших домкратов.
There were sharp knives sticking out.
И земля перед этими ножами вымывалась
The ground was taken outside
и подавалась сюда наверх.
and lifted up.
Эти дюбинги укреплялись, и так секция за секцией продвигался подземный туннель.
This is how built this tunnel section by section.
Туннель не был полностью закончен,
The tunnel was never finished.
только отдельные кусочки.
Just several sections.
Вот. После Второй мировой войны 5 лет еще продолжалось строительство,
After World War II, they kept building it for 5 more years.
но изменилось политическое, экономическое положение, поэтому их прекратили достраивать.
Then everything changed, politics-wise, economy-wise, and the building stopped. There is a Russian city called Khabarovsk, and engineers built this type of a tunnel under that river.
Которые советские военные использовали для внезапного нападения на Японию в 1945 году.
And in 1945, Soviet soldiers used that tunnel to attack Japan.
Miltuikov minces no words on Stalin's intent. The content of the Soviet operational plans, the ideological guidelines, and the military propaganda, combined with information on immediate military preparation of the Red Army for an offensive, attest clearly to the intention of the Soviet government to attack Germany in the summer of 1941. He concludes that at first the opening strikes against Germany, Operation Grossa, Thunderstorm, was scheduled for June 12th, but that the Kremlin later fatefully shifted the date to July 15th, according to 𝐬𝐿𝐫𝐞. Ultimately, what we now know today was a secret in 1941. The Soviet leadership made a faithful miscalculation by not striking first. 𝐬𝐿𝐫𝐞 speculates that Stalin delayed the date for the attack when he learned on May 12th of Rudolf Hess's flight to Scotland. Stalin feared that if Hess's peace mission succeeded and the British withdrew from the war, the Red Army would be left to stand alone against the Germans. When it became clear that Hess's mission had failed, Stalin set July 15th as the date for Thunderstorm, 23 days after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Had the Red Army attacked on the original scheduled date, 𝐬𝐿𝐫𝐞 believes it would have succeeded. But there was a logical belief amongst Russian military leadership that Hitler could not invade. He had, after all, no oil. And Russian spies had crawled around Germany and determined that Germany had no winter clothing or winter oils for the vehicles, and none planned. And knowing the Germans were pretty clever people, nobody would believe that they thought they could win the war against Russia before winter. But we have been told ever since that the Germans were just bad at planning, that nobody wanted to tell Hitler. Corners in logistics were cut because Hitler demanded it. But is that really the case? Is it the case that Hitler was suddenly in a rush? Why? Initially, after the invasion of France, Hitler had even released some of his soldiers and cut production of some munitions. So at that time, Hitler was not planning on going east anytime soon, after all, but all of that changed. And it's not like somebody was not aware of what this would mean. It was in fact one of the most unlikely people to raise the flag for the need for winter clothing. It was Joseph Goebbels, much to the scorn of the Wehrmacht commanders who shunned the idea. As it turned out, Hitler too had been promised this, and was even shown a display of German winter clothing. However, he had been lied to outright when told this would be available, told by the German army quartermaster, who was fired when it was discovered. Much too late for those thousands of German soldiers who froze to death, paying the price. But Hitler had to jump off now. Why, it seems Hitler had discovered the Russians' plans to invade the West, and thus the pressing need to attack first. Even if he knew he was not ready, he simply had no choice. Again, it was inevitable for the two to fight, but a lot of things make far more sense when seen in that light. In fact, it explains a lot of historical questions. Another little piece of proof would be the simple phrase book the Russian soldiers had been handed out a month before Barbarossa, translating important sentences from Russian to German. Things like, "Where's the mayor's office?" and "Don't worry, the Red Army will be here soon," into German. If they were preparing for a defensive war, why would they need that? And, of course, the German soldiers had been given the same book by their command, just the other way round. Now, the Russians barely had any maps of their own country, yet their soldiers had been issued military topographical maps of Germany and German-occupied territories. Just saying. Stalin transformed the Soviet Union into a militarized state, prioritizing offensive capabilities over defensive ones. By late 1930, the Soviet war economy was producing massive quantities of military equipment, designated and designed for offensive operations. For example, as Surovov cites the production of tanks and aircrafts as evidence for offensive focus, with numbers far exceeding that of defensive needs. The Soviet Union's 5-year plan, starting in 1928, emphasized heavy industry and armament. By 1941, the USSR had produced over 20,000 tanks and 18,000 aircraft, dwarfing the production of any other nation, including almost all of them, including certainly Germany, which only had 3,350 tanks for Barbarossa. This unraveling is just the beginning. We have not talked about the production, the diplomatic advances, and we need to talk about Stalin and FDR and their relationship, and what that has cost the world ever since. Hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel, liking, follows, and maybe even join me on Patreon to help out. I am just a guy, a historian, traveling around all these historic places in Europe on my own dime, trying to bring them to you.